Hello, everyone. In this unit, we're going to discuss memory and cognition. So, before we get started, I want you to look at these pennies for a minute. Can you tell me which one is actually a penny? Don't cheat. Don't go find a penny somewhere. Now, as you're looking at these, I want you to think about something. How many pennies have you seen in your lifetime? You've probably seen many. But unless you're a coin collector or something like that, you've maybe never really paid attention to exactly what the penny looks like. Have you figured out which one it is yet? It's the first one. So what I'm hoping that this demonstrates is that our memory is not perfect. It is not a video camera that records everything. There are aspects that go into memory. And one of the first ones is we have to pay attention. So let's talk a little about the process of memory. So, generally, when we're looking at memory, there's three major processes. One is encoding. This is the process of taking the information and making it so that it can be stored. Then, once we have encoded it, we then store those memories. And so, this is the retention of those encoded representations of that information. And then finally, we have to be able to find it. We have to be able to retrieve that memory. So, it's the act of recalling and remembering that stored information when we need it. So, as I said just a moment ago, one of the important parts of memory, though, is attention. When we have divided attention, it is actually hard for us to be able to encode information. So, we can only encode things that which we are actively paying attention to. And so, if you are doing other things, people think that they can dual task, or they think they can play on their phone, or they can listen to music, or they can do other things. But all those things reduce our attention and therefore reduce our ability to encode information. So, when you are doing other things, especially if you're sitting in a class or even now listening to this video and you're doing other things, this makes it more difficult for you to recall that information later because it never gets encoded properly to begin with. So, we're going to use this idea of different memory stores to talk about memory in this class. So, back in the 60s, there's this proposal, these three different types of memory stores. We have a sensory store, a short term store, and a long term store. Sometimes you hear these said as memory: sensory memory, short term memory, and long term memory. So, each of these different memory stores serve a different function. They retain information that has been coded in specific ways to itself and holds that information for a period of time, and then has the ability to maintain a particular amount of that information. So here you can see kind of a flow chart. So as we have information that's coming in, whether it's something you're watching or you're hearing, um, that this information comes in and it first goes to a sensory storage. And once we're in this sensory storage, things for which we are paying attention then can get encoded into a short term memory. And short term memory is this kind of working space that can actively manipulate the information, the memories that we have, which is then can be encoded into a long-term storage, which is information which presumably is going to be harder to forget later. So, what exactly is sensory memory? So, this is a memory storage system that briefly holds information that comes in from each of your different sensory systems. We often think about the visual sensory memories. And kind of one example of this is you could think of a sparkler. And people are able to use a sparkler to draw in the air, write your name, draw shapes, and this is your sensory memory, that the ability that all of that information is kind of held there for a very brief amount of time. This is for we're talking about fractions of a second. But what this allows is it allows for us to see the world as continuous, that if we didn't have some type of sensory store, that this could make things look very choppy to us. And so instead, this kind of like little holdover of information allows us to smooth out the information that's coming in from our senses. Then we have the short-term storage or short-term memory. And so this is a memory storage that briefly holds a limited amount of information. And this then becomes kind of a placeholder for information so that we can work with it if needed. And so this is why we sometimes refer to this as working memory, because it's an active process for which we can manipulate that information while we're keeping it available for current use. And this can be once again for sounds and images or even ideas. So this can be our thought process if we're trying to make a decision about something and we're holding information in our head. That this can be then you're seen as the working memory. And this working memory has a limited capacity to it. That the more things that we try to hold in that memory, then the less we're able to recall. Back in the 50s, George Miller demonstrated this idea that it was seven plus or minus two. The magic number seven plus or minus two was the amount of information that someone could keep in their short term memory. This was what was called memory span. Now, when you say seven plus or minus two items, what do you actually mean? Because we can use something known as chunking, which is a way that we can organize information into a meaningful unit. So, for instance, if I'm calling the university, their phone number, so that's then 10 digits of number, 281, 283, and then four digits afterwards. But if we chunk this information and I can remember the area codes 281, and I can remember that the first three digits for all phones at the university is 283, then those become two chunks. And then I only have to remember the last four digits, and I could even chunk them. So if I knew a number was 281, 283, 32, 31, now I have chunked that. And so I've taken 10 individual digits and now I've turned it into just four chunks of information. So that's a way that we can expand the amount of capacity that we have in our short term storage. Now, look at this image here. So, what this is representing a mental rotation task. And so you're being asked to look at the first figure there and determine whether A, B, or C is the same figure but just rotated in a different way. Now, this also requires a memory, We remember the shape of it, and then we need to manipulate it in our mind. But you can't really talk about that kind of memory in terms of seven plus or minus two chunks of information. So, this is where this concept of short term memory has been expanded to talk about working memory. So, Badley and Hitch in the 70s came up with an alternative way of conceptualizing short term memory, and they called it working memory. And this working memory had three components to it. One is the rehearsal loop, which is what we were originally thought of short term memory. And they called it this because in order to keep, if you were told a phone number or somebody gave you some type of other information, then you could repeat it in your head over and over until you needed it in order for that information to stay in there longer. So that's why they called it the rehearsal loop. But then they also had the conception of the visuospatial sketch pad, which permits people to temporarily hold and manipulate visual images. So what I showed you in the previous slide is an example of that. But you could also think about if you were looking at your bedroom and you wanted to think, what would this room look like if I moved the bed over to the other wall or the dresser over by the window? And so being able to have a mental image that you can manipulate would be this visuospatial sketch pad. And then we have the executive control center. And this handles the limited amount of information that someone can juggle at one time. So, when you're trying to remember a phone number, if somebody then says something else to you or then ask you to do something else, then that interrupts the your ability to kind of rehearse something in your mind. And so therefore your limited amount of control or limited amount of resources you have could then go away, or that you would lose track of something. But then this is also how you can keep things mentally together. So if you were trying to weigh out the pros and cons of making a decision, you can keep those ideas all in your head together. Now, once again, if you're trying to do all of that mentally in your mind and are being asked to do a mental rotation or remember phone numbers or something like that, then you're going to exceed the capacity of that type of memory system. But that executive control center system is what kind of helps allocate those resources.